Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Lewis McGlynn. First up tonight, a Ukraine update on day 518 of the Russian invasion. The EU has agreed to ban exports of battlefield equipment and aviation parts to Belarus today, expanding sanctions on the Russian ally over its involvement in Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Spain, the current holder of the EU's presidency, said the sanctions were a response to the situation in Belarus and the involvement of Belarus in the Russian aggression against Ukraine. The decision is still to be finalised and will take effect if none of the 27 EU member states raise last-minute objections before Friday. Ukrainian General Prosecutor's Office has said it has opened a criminal case into a politician suspected of taking a luxury holiday in the Maldives in breach of a wartime ban on private travel abroad. The politician has not been named and no charges have yet been brought in the case. Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal has announced that Ukraine plans to invest $1.08 billion into domestic drone manufacturing this year. The Kremlin said it was impossible for Russia to return to the Black Sea grain export deal for now, as an agreement related to Russian interests was not being implemented. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba visited Liberia on Wednesday, the first visit to the country in Ukrainian diplomatic history, according to the Foreign Ministry, in an effort to ensure the export of Ukrainian grain to Africa after the collapse of the Black Sea grain deal. Russian armed forces claim to have struck at a Ukrainian fuel warehouse and training centre in Donetsk. They have also claimed to have made an advance near Serhiva in Luhansk Oblast, which is close to the border with Kharkiv Oblast. Zaspilny, Ukraine's state broadcaster, reports that during the night and morning of the 26th of July, the Russian army shelled 6 communities of Sumy Oblast. A military court in Moscow has sentenced a dual Russian-Ukrainian citizen to 22 years in jail for blowing up a rail track in Russia's Bryansk region last summer. A decade-long failure by the UK government allowed the Wagner network to grow and spread its tentacles deep into Africa and exploit vulnerable countries, according to a highly critical report from the UK's Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Moldova has announced it will reduce the number of diplomatic staff Russia has in the country after reports that the Russian embassy in Chisinau had installed a large amount of satellite equipment, which Moldova said could be used for espionage. Ukraine is still considering whether or not to stick with its decision to bar its athletes from competing against Russians or Belarusians a year before the start of the Paris Olympics in 2024. The Kremlin has said that President Putin is planning to visit China in October. The Russian parliament has backed legislation increasing the maximum age limit to 30 for compulsory military service after more than a year into Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. Top story tonight. Speaking in a radio interview this morning, Lord Foulkes stated that the UK was never meant to be a union of equal partners, saying that is a myth that has been put around by the SNP. Lord Foulkes was interviewed over his proposal that the UK government should sanction the Scottish Government for work carried out on its independence mandate. His comments were preceded by a statement from Professor Robert Hazel, who said the idea that civil servants shouldn't work on issues promoted by the Scottish Government was puzzling. Professor Hazel concluded that it's perfectly proper for civil servants in Scotland to be working on the current Scottish Government's agenda, and that includes their plans for independence. Mary Black, MP, the SNP's deputy leader at Westminster, said, "It's increasingly clear that the pro-Brexit Labour Party can't be trusted to stand up for Scotland. Lord Foulkes has let the cat out of the bag by admitting that the UK is not a partnership of equals. By saying the quiet part out loud and demanding the UK government impose sanctions against the Scottish Government for carrying out its democratic mandate, the unelected Lord Foulkes has shown the Labour Party can't be trusted to defend Scottish democracy. Voters in Scotland have known for some time that the UK hasn't been a partnership of equals. That is why we've had continuous Tory governments we do not vote for imposed on us, and why we were dragged out of the European Union against our will." I'm joined tonight by my guest Sandra. Sandra, what are your thoughts on this statement by Lord Foulkes here?
Good evening, Lewis, and thank you for inviting me along tonight. Lord Foulkes, now I've got lots of things to say about Lord Foulkes, but I will stick to question which you had mentioned, you'll remember that Lord Foulkes was also in the Scottish Parliament as well, so I know him quite well. He certainly has let the cat out of the bag, and then we discover that a letter which is in the Donald Dewar Library in the Scottish Parliament from Tony Blair mentions the fact that basically, Scotland and England are in an equal partnership in Westminster. So there lies, basically Lord Foulkes, mouthing off, I might say that word, again, basically. First thing it came into his head. I mean, he's quite right, isn't it? It isn't equal partnership, absolutely not. But it's certainly not on the part of the SNP, who said it would be an unequal partnership. It's always been an unequal partnership when you have over 600 MPs down south in Westminster, and only 56, 57 of them come from Scotland, so it could never, ever be equal at all. But it's a fact of the matter of Lord Foulkes, who obviously weeks ago, months ago perhaps even, had said that he'd spoken to, a minister, a cabinet secretary, who said they were investigating in regards to looking at independence and looking at why we should be using civil servants for that. So he sort of started this ball rolling and continued to, meddle in that. And now we see that he's basically talking, as he normally does, a lot of rubbish. There's no truth in it whatsoever that we should not be an equal partnership. The fact of the matter is, because of Westminster, we are unable to have an equal partnership with Westminster, who continually tell us that basically we can't do this, and now they're interfering with legislation which Scottish Parliament is trying to put through, but can't get it through simply because Westminster is blocking us. So in a way, he has let the cat out of the bag, thankfully. Perhaps for him, he thought, the egg would be on our faces, but the egg is actually on Lord Foulkes' face, as you said earlier, an unelected member of the House of Lords, which I would hope in an independent Scotland, all of them would be unelected, because there would be no House of Lords there, basically.
And would you agree with Mary Black's statement that this is saying the quiet part out loud and perhaps seeing the real attitude that Lord Foulkes and those like him have towards not only independence but Scotland as a whole?
They've always had that attitude. As I said, I mean, I've known him quite well. He was in the Scottish Parliament. Basically, they've always had that attitude. It's just the fact that now it seems to have came to a head when you look at the media, not Broadcasting Scotland, obviously, but other media who constantly do Scotland down. All the news that comes out is bad. You just need to look at the situation with the ferries, etc., which unfortunately the people in the islands are now seeing a drop in tourism because of the media coverage, not because it's the truth, because of the media coverage. So it's always been there. I think what's happened with Lord Foulkes, because of the type of media we're getting and the coverage and the continual onslaught in anything the Scottish Government does, it's emboldened these people who have always had these ideas, who've always thought that. Why they would want to go down there is beyond me, particularly the House of Lords, but I think we don't need to use our imagination to wonder why they do it, but they do it anyway. So it's always been there, but now they're emboldened enough to come out with it. They feel as though they can say it, because basically the media have been saying it for the last, well, I would say the last 9 months to a year. It's been a complete onslaught. So they're emboldened now to say that, and they're coming out of the woodwork.
Thanks, Sandra. A new poll has shown that a clear majority of Scots want more powers for the Scottish Parliament and decisions about Scotland to be made in Scotland, not Westminster. The Survation survey shows that the majority of voters are against suggestions from senior Tories to review and roll back some currently devolved powers. This comes after repeated legislation giving Westminster powers to overturn or block laws passed in the Scottish Parliament, including the unprecedented use of Section 35 and the proposed amendments to the current Levelling Up Bill, which would give the Tories powers to scrap Scottish environmental rules. SNP Deputy Leader Keith Brown said, "The poll shows that the majority of the Scottish public are firmly against the Tories' deliberate, coordinated attempts to reverse devolution and roll back the powers of the Scottish Parliament and force Scotland under Westminster control." Lord Frost is just saying the quiet part out loud when it comes to the UK government's disdain for Scotland, but sadly, the Labour Party are equally as culpable in working with the Tories to block devolution and deny Scotland's democratic right to choose our own future. Sandra, do you believe that more powers in Holyrood are what's needed to help get Scotland out of the current crisis she's in?
Certainly more powers, but independence is the most powerful one we could have. Independence, I'm not saying it would solve everything overnight, but that is the one thing that we certainly do need, and people need to realise that. But if you're speaking about this moment just now, in regards to the fact that the Highlands and Islands and other cities as well used to get money from Europe, and now obviously the Westminster government, we can't do that because of Brexit. We have this so-called levelling up, and yet here we are. Well, I'm in Glasgow, we're sitting here and you're in the studio in Glasgow also. We get nothing from this so-called levelling up, and yet we have pretty astute poverty in some areas of Glasgow. So absolutely we need more powers. And if I hear one more politician, particularly from the Labour Party, telling us that we must mitigate some of these, the rape clause, that, bedroom tax, that type of thing. If they tell me one more time that we, who don't get all of our resources back, from Westminster, that we should be mitigating, that is quite a horror story actually. And this is what they've been pushing, and not to give Glasgow any of the levelling up, or other parts, but particularly for the Glasgow area and people who are suffering in poverty, is really a slap in the face to the Scottish people. And this is their way. I think, if I remember correctly, one of the areas that got levelling up was down in a very wealthy area of England, which was a Tory seat, and they didn't even need the levelling up. So people are suffering from it, and we need to get these powers to take people out of poverty. We're doing our absolute best here, in the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood, to try and get over some of the facets of this Westminster terrible government and the Brexit deal, but we can't do it on the limited amount of monies we get back from Westminster. So we need to push for more powers, yes. But as I said before, independence is the only thing that will let us escape from this abhorrent, that's the word I'll use, abhorrent Tory government in Westminster, and Labour as well, because they are now just following on from everything that the Tories have said. They're not going to step back and take control of anything. They're just going to implement the Tory policies. So it's a lesson for us all. You can't trust any unionist party.
And once again, that phrase, saying the quiet part out loud, is coming, it almost feels like they're getting a bit desperate and just attempting to ramp up, rolling back more and more powers and ramp up this anti-Scottish rhetoric.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's a good choice of words there, basically, Lewis. I mean, I noticed, and you'll have noticed it yourself when you look at some of the elections, Tories and Labour working together, I'll call them the unionist parties, working together to ensure that the pro-independence parties didn't get in. So they've been working together that way. And basically, you've come in across now where it's not necessarily even fighting a Labour seat or a Tory seat, you're actually fighting a unionist seat, and they've started to coalesce together. And this is that, they're, from there on, they're ramping up, as you say, the attack on Scotland. Now, I don't know why they're doing that, because basically, well, I know why they're doing it, because they just want to leave us with nothing. But when it comes to the fact of it, we're not going to vote for them. So they're not going to, they're not going to get anybody elected. In fact, I don't even think we'll get Ian Murray, the only Labour MP in Scotland, elected either. I think they'll be wiped out at the next election. But it's either the fact that they don't care, which I think partly is the number of them really don't care about Scotland. They just want our riches and what we've got. Basically, we're a colony, as far as a lot of them are concerned, where they can do with it what they like. But you can only go so far with people. You can't push them over the edge too much, and something will break in that respect. But your words about ramping up is absolutely right, and we need to take, and I'm talking about the party here in this respect, the Scottish Government, the SNP and the Greens, we need to keep an eye on that, about this ramping up, and we need to have an answer for it. And that's something I think we should be pressing, our relative parties into what is your answer to this ramping up of the fact that they're just trying to push us over the edge.
Thank you. The UK government appears unlikely to recover any money from a healthcare recruitment agency that allegedly failed to deliver on a multi-million-pound PPE contract awarded during the COVID pandemic. The Department of Health and Social Care has confirmed it is in a dispute over the £20 million+ contract awarded to SG Recruitment UK Limited. However, the agency's parent company has gone into liquidation, raising questions about whether the government can recoup any funds. SG Recruitment was granted its first contract in April 2020, only 5 days after it was referred to the government's fast-track VIP lane, following an introduction by the Conservative peer Lord Chadlington, who was a director and shareholder of SGH, SG Recruitment's parent company. A month later, the agency, which has since been renamed, was awarded a second multi-million-pound contract. When SG Recruitment gained its first COVID contract, it was a small, loss-making company that supplied healthcare workers to the NHS and appears to have had no experience providing PPE. It has since emerged in a court judgment that its parent company, Sumner Group Holdings, registered in Jersey, was facing financial difficulties less than 2 years earlier. It went into liquidation last October. The revelations raise further questions about the government's buying of PPE during the pandemic, when it suspended normal procurement rules and the extent of due diligence it carried out on companies before awarding large contracts. The DHSC has consistently defended its processes, but critics have pointed to £9 billion spent on PPE that was subsequently written off, and the operation of the VIP lane, which gave high priority to offers from companies with political connections. Companies referred to the VIP lane, which has since been ruled unlawful, had a 10 times greater success rate for being awarded contracts. The DHSC has recently stated that commercial discussions were continuing on 58 PPE contracts it says were breached or failed to meet required standards, and that £1.6 billion in public money was at risk from such contracts. Sandra, what do you make of the DHSC's seemingly serial mismanagement of these contracts?
You couldn't make it up, really, could you? You could not make it up. Billions of pounds given to their pals, basically. You've just explained the fact that, they were in trouble 2 years previously. They'd only set up 5 days, and then after that went bust. Now they're in liquidation. It's an absolute disgrace. It's criminal, absolutely criminal. And you just wonder, I don't know who's involved in, we know who got the contracts, but I don't know who was completely involved in giving these contracts, i.e. the government, the Westminster government. But these people should be hauled up and jailed. They should be jailed. I mean, you've got people out there, I know folk who, when I was an MSP, struggling, trying to get contracts and couldn't get contracts, not just for PPE, people going bankrupt. And these people suffered, lots of small businesses, they all suffered, they went to the wall, basically hundreds, thousands of people were unemployed, and yet these folk walked away, or in Michelle Moan's case, sailed away with millions of pounds. They should be brought before a court, they should be jailed. I'm really livid about this, and I think most people are livid also, that these folk could get this so-called fast track, and then they tell you, well, actually, there's nothing we can do about it now. And they can change their name within a couple of days and then start trading again. It's an absolute disgrace. Disgraceful.
It does seem awfully convenient that the parent company owned by the Tory Conservative peer, Lord Chadlington, just so happens to go into liquidation when they're and those millions of pounds just vanish Meanwhile, the
But,
nurses and doctors who were actually in the hospitals during the pandemic were desperate for PPE that never arrived.
well, absolutely. There's still a big pile of it, isn't there? That's getting destroyed apparently, costing millions of pounds, sitting in this big vast field, which was never able to be used. It was just dumped there, never able to be used. But I missed that point. I didn't miss it as such. I meant to pick it up, on the Lord who was obviously overseeing this and part of that company. Now, surely is that not a conflict of interest? Is that not a conflict of interest that you're on a board there or you're a shareholder there, and yet you're part of a government that can award you a contract? I mean, it's criminal. It's absolutely fraudulent and criminal, and they should be brought before a court. Well, sorry, allegedly. I'll say allegedly, but okay. I've been corrected, viewers. I'll say allegedly in case I get sued or whatever it may be. But I think most like-minded people let them appear in court and prove that they allegedly didn't do any wrong. But I think they should be locked up and jailed, absolutely, and their assets taken off them. By the way,
Thank you, Sandra. Dame Alison Rose, the chief executive of NatWest Group, has stood down after a row over the closure of Nigel Farage's bank accounts with the private bank Coutts, which NatWest owns. She became the bank's first female chief executive in late 2019 when it was known as the Royal Bank of Scotland Group. The bank, which was bailed out by taxpayers during the 2008 financial crisis, is still 38.6% owned by the UK government. Rose resigned from the banking group after the former UKIP leader complained to the BBC about a report that claimed his accounts with Coutts were closed for commercial reasons. The broadcaster has since apologised and amended its story. Rose had admitted earlier that she was the source of the BBC story about Farage's bank accounts, for which she issued an apology. Coutts had said that the closure was based on a commercial decision based on Farage's accounts falling below a wealth, borrowing and investment threshold. However, a dossier obtained by Farage using a subject access request also showed that reputational damage resulting from media coverage of his political views were part of the considerations on retaining him as a client. In a statement released in the early hours of Wednesday, the NatWest Group chairman, Sir Howard Davies, said, "The board and Alison Rose have agreed by mutual consent that she will step down as CEO of the NatWest Group. It is a sad moment." In her own statement, Rose thanked her colleagues for all that they have done, adding, "I remain immensely proud of the progress the bank has made in supporting people, families and businesses across the UK and building the foundations for sustainable growth." There was an announcement after markets closed on Tuesday that Rose was set to stay at the bank, but her resignation was confirmed just before 2 a.m. on Wednesday morning, following a media storm, with several newspapers having called for her to quit. Reports late on Tuesday suggested that the Prime Minister and Chancellor had significant concerns about her staying in her role. By 11 p.m, shortly after front pages were revealed, the board of NatWest was locked in emergency talks over her future. Davies said that the board would launch an independent review that would look into the closure and lessons that could be learned. The Financial Conduct Authority said it welcomed NatWest's independent review, which it had pressed for when it contacted the group in the wake of Farage's allegations. Sandra, what do you make of Alison Rose's resignation from the NatWest Group?
I think it's very sad, but I do have to say, in this respect, I think allegedly that Mr. Farage didn't have enough funds for Coots, for the bank, basically. But I do think that regardless of what your political beliefs are, unfortunately, that shouldn't be a reason for you not to be able to have an account in a bank. I think that could apply to anyone. But this is the caveat. Would it apply to anyone? No, it wouldn't. Basically, if, as allegedly was said at the very beginning, that he didn't have enough monies to bank there, then basically, yeah, I wonder if he hadn't asked for this investigation or looked at these emails or whatever they were in regards to the comments made in his, the media and the political aspect of it all, whether he would have been allowed to bank with them or not. So that's one point. But the second point, as I said, whilst I am no fan of Mr Farage's and certainly not his politics anyway, I think he's a disgrace to so right wing. It's unbelievable. I do think that it's a very tricky thing if you stop anyone from banking on your political beliefs, unless obviously there's certain political beliefs obviously that people would just not basically speak to you or let you bank at all, I would imagine. But I think it's a tricky situation. I do feel sorry. I think she was very good, and also the fact that it's cost, what is it, £650 million. The banks had to write off £650 million, and this is all down to Mr Farage, I believe. But at the end of the day, I do think you cannot stop anyone from banking in regards to their political beliefs and use that unless you can find something other than that to stop them from banking with you.
Thank you, Sandra. Talking to The Guardian in his first major interview since leaving the government, Zach Goldsmith has said that Michael Gove is a monster if he continues to rubbish green policies while fully understanding the urgency of the climate crisis. And Grant Shapps, the Energy and Net Zero Secretary, is taking backward steps. The former International Environment Minister also conceded that Brexit, for which he voted, could be detrimental for the environment in the end if ministers continued to abandon climate commitments in the face of a right-wing resurgence in the Tory party. Zach Goldsmith, an ally of Boris Johnson, resigned from his post in June after serving in government since 2019, claiming that the Prime Minister was apathetic about the environment. Some days later, it was revealed that the UK government intended to drop its promised target of delivering £11.6 billion to developing countries to tackle the climate crisis. The former minister appeared unimpressed by the Cabinet's recent pronouncements on the environment and said he was confused by Shapps, who, rather than promoting climate policy, has appeared to mostly spend his time attacking climate activists and vowing to max out North Sea oil and gas. Goldsmith was also critical of the Levelling Up Secretary, Michael Gove's recent comments on climate change, saying, "I don't think you can understand and care about the gravity of this issue and, at the same time, be willing to take your foot off the accelerator for political expediency. I just think that would require you to be a monster." Goldsmith was one of Brexit's biggest champions, arguing that without the EU, the UK could implement many animal welfare measures, including banning fur and foie gras, stopping live exports of farm animals for fattening and slaughter, and banning crates for pigs and cages for chickens. But he has now conceded that exit from the Union could be environmentally damaging, as under a right-wing climate-sceptic UK government, protections the UK had in the EU could be rolled back. Sandra, do you think it's almost disingenuous for Goldsmith to be coming out in criticism of the government after supporting many of these policies that he helped put in place?
Well, absolutely. I mean, basically, yeah, he used the word monster. Possibly that's a good word to use. I've got plenty others I might have used for them, not just certain ministers, but the whole lot of them in the Tory party. Basically, he's obviously thought that Brexit was a good thing, and it's obviously not, and it hasn't. Having not the European laws to protect animals, it didn't stop you from bringing these laws in anyway. If you were still a member of Europe, other countries, they bring their own laws in anyway, basically, and it doesn't stop them from doing it. So that's just an absolute nonsense. The first thing that he said. And I think he's been disingenuous. Possibly that's quite a nice word to use to think that basically folk with the Westminster government, even though he's a party or a part of the government, would even listen to him. Basically, because if you're disingenuous to certain people, you've got to know these people. You've got to know what their so-called policies are, and basically, I think he's just he's annoyed, he's angry, he's put a lot of work into it, but the fact of the matter that he thought that these people were going to put that forward, to me, is it's just that he's pretty naive if he would want to a word for it. I think he's been pretty naive in Brexit, and he's pretty naive in thinking that the Tory government would stand by anything in that respect. And really, I think he should be apologising to the country as a whole for backing Brexit and thinking that he was going to be the champion of the environment, when all you've left with was this wee grey island who is basically turning, the rules on animal welfare, and also obviously pollution in the rivers and oil and gas, doing everything that he thought that they weren't going to do. So naivety to me is what I would use for Zach Goldsmith, and I think he should be the one that should be apologising to the people of this country and coming out and saying that Brexit has been an absolute failure and they should never have voted for it.
I think naive is quite a kind perspective to have on him. I think a more cynical mind could say that after seeing just the extent of the damage being done and just how not apathetic, as he put it, the government and Prime Minister was to the environment, that he's now bailed out of the sinking ship and is trying to save what face he can.
Yeah, that's a good point to make as well, Lewis. Absolutely. Maybe I'm being kind then. Sometimes.
But who knows, I suppose.
Okay.
Thank you, Sandra. A decade-long failure by the UK government has allowed the Wagner network to grow and spread its tentacles deep into Africa and exploit vulnerable countries, according to a highly critical report from the UK's Foreign Affairs Select Committee. It called on the UK government to prescribe the Wagner Group in the UK and to make a far more concerted effort to stop it using the City of London as a financial centre. Wagner is a private mercenary army led by Yevgeny Prigozhin that has played a key role in the war in Ukraine. In June, Prigozhin and his troops staged a short-lived coup against authorities in Moscow, and the relationship between the Wagner leader and Vladimir Putin is currently unclear. Describing the overall UK approach to private military companies as complacent, the report says the UK has imposed sanctions on about half as many members of the Wagner Group as the US and the EU. The committee has given the Foreign Office a published list of 49 Wagner associates that it says the government should examine. Evidence given to the committee shows that Wagner not only has worked for Russia, but has also, for instance, been active in Libya in the service of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. An anonymised witness who had defected from the group said Wagner is involved in promoting the interests of the political elite of Russia outside the countries of the former Soviet Union, and the implementation of large-scale business projects under intergovernmental agreements. No other Russian paramilitary structure operates in this way. Wagner has a complete monopoly in this field. The committee concluded for nearly 10 years the government has underplayed and underestimated the Wagner network's activities, as well as the security implications of its significant expansion. The government has not told us anything specific that it is doing to challenge the network's influence and impunity in countries other than Ukraine, beyond sanctions coordinations, which itself appears limited. The report reveals that it took 6 weeks for the government to identify the lead department responsible for countering Wagner. It describes the Foreign Office Minister, Leo Doherty, as being unable to demonstrate joined-up working within the department, lessons sharing, strategic thinking, or a clear definition of what the Wagner network is. The committee said the Wagner Group was definitely operating in 7 countries and quite possibly 10 more. The 7 were Ukraine, Syria, the Central African Republic, Sudan, Libya, Mozambique, and Mali. In a major criticism, the committee said it is a significant failing to see the Wagner network primarily through the prism of Europe, not least given its geographic spread, the impact of its activities on UK interests further abroad, and the fact that its wealth creation sits largely in Africa. Sandra, what are your thoughts on seemingly yet another failure of the UK government to add to the ever-growing list?
Mm-hmm. It's really quite worrying, isn't it? It's really worrying when you talk to people and you mentioned Ukraine and your introduction there as well of what's happening, and here you have this Wagner Group, who are operating in all these countries, as you say, Africa Syria as well. It's very, very worrying for the world at large that this has been allowed to continue. And obviously the UK government has known about it and supposedly been looking at it for 10 years, possibly even more in that respect. And I'm amazed that the report is very, very good. And the one thing I did pick up when I was looking through it, and you mentioned it in your introduction as well, was the fact of the financial, how they can, their financing in the City of London. I mean, surely, goodness, that's something that should have been looked at straight away. I mean, you've got this group who are supposed to be looking at them. They've done nothing in the last 10 years, and yet they're still putting finances into the City of London. That's one thing that, I think should be looked at completely. And if they haven't been doing their job, if you weren't doing your job, if I wasn't doing my job, somebody would have you and they'd be speaking to you, and you would generally every couple of months things would you'd be looked over to see how you're progressing. Nothing like that at all seems to have happened at all, and I just think it's a disgrace. Yes, it's worrying. It makes you very angry when you think of what's been happening in Syria. When you've got this group of mercenaries who are obviously well trained, obviously well paid, and obviously, one of the questions is, where are they getting the arms from as well? When you look at what happened in Iraq and various other, unfortunately, countries, the first lot of people that were in to help them were your arms manufacturers. So I would be asking, could we ask that question as well? Where are they getting these arms from? And here's maybe a wee bit of conspiracy theory, I don't know, but we have a Russian lord sitting in the House of Lords. We've had Boris Johnson going to his lovely place in Italy. We've had Boris Johnson going there. Is there any connection there in that respect? Because it's been a Tory government in the years that they've supposedly been looking at this Wagner group. I mean, it's not just the UK, obviously, there's other countries involved, there's Europe as well. But they're supposed to be getting together and stopping this. And basically, my big worry is you've got this group of mercenaries who's caused all of this bother, killed thousands of people, throughout particularly in Eastern Europe anyway. And it shouldn't be allowed to go on, actually. It shouldn't be allowed to go on. And I thank the committee for the report that they've got. But there must be more they can do, i.e. in sanctions, or finding out how are they getting their arms. The first thing you should do is stop them from putting any money into the City of London, and basically finding out where they're getting these arms from. Are we training anybody? We don't know these things either.
Something that was particularly concerning for me is not only did they not seem to know what was happening with Wagner, it took 6 weeks for the government to identify the lead department just to be found on the counting Wagner. So if you can't even find out whose job it is to be dealing with this, what hope do you possibly have of dealing with the threat itself? It seems insane just how mismanaged these major important departments are within the government.
Well, do you know the amazing thing is the fact that people go, the Palace of Westminster, the House of Westminster, the government, the home of democracy and all that stuff. And really, when you look at all the things that's came out in the last couple of years, they're so incompetent that basically, you couldn't, well, I won't say the words in a brewery, but you couldn't organise that. Basically, they're so incompetent and people are getting to realise that. So it's not this great place, basically. It's the fact that, as you've already said, 6 weeks to find out who was running it, and yet what's been going on previous to that. So they're so incompetent, not just in that, but I think in every field. And the money that's getting wasted, and yet we're not getting told the truth via the media either.
Thank you, Sandra. Wildfires were burning in at least 9 countries across the Mediterranean as blazes spread in Croatia, Italy, and Portugal, with thousands of firefighters in Europe and North Africa working to contain flames stoked by high temperatures, dry conditions, and strong winds. In Algeria, at least 34 people were killed, where 8,000 firefighters battled blazes across the tinder-dry north on Tuesday. Fires burned in a total of 15 provinces, leading to the evacuation of more than 1,500 people from their properties. The Algerian online news site TSA quoted the National Meteorological Office as saying temperatures had reached about 50 centigrade or 122 degrees Fahrenheit in some regions. Italy has been hit by violent storms and wildfires. At least 7 people were killed on Tuesday after storms in the north and wildfires in Sicily. Greece has also been particularly hard hit this summer, with authorities evacuating more than 20,000 people in recent days from homes and resorts the south of the holiday island of Rhodes. Close to 3,000 tourists had returned home by plane as of Tuesday, according to figures from the Transport Ministry, and tour operators have cancelled upcoming trips. In France, nearly 100 firefighters were trying to contain a wildfire in the municipalities of Cagny-sur-Mer and Villeneuve-Loubet, close to the Nice International Airport, officials said on Tuesday. In Croatia, winds were so strong that firefighting aircrafts could not take off, local media reported. Firefighters battled wildfires that were spreading just south of the Adriatic city of Dubrovnik, a tourism destination, late on Tuesday. A rapidly spreading wildfire at the centre of Spain's island of Gran Canaria on Tuesday prompted authorities to remove several hundred villagers, shut 3 roads, and deploy firefighting helicopters. In Portugal, usually one of the European countries worst hit by wildfires, according to EU data, hundreds of Portuguese firefighters scrambled to put out flames near the popular holiday destination of Cascais on Tuesday, with strong winds complicating efforts. The wildfire started in a mountainous area of the Sintra Cascais Park, which covers about 145 square kilometres west of Lisbon. More than 600 firefighters were brought in water-bombing planes also battled the blaze, but had to stop operating as the night set in. Sandra, this is seemingly yet more complications of this ongoing climate crisis. These wildfires are becoming more frequent and more intense every year.
Yeah. Once again, it's you obviously feel for the people who are living there, basically having to flee for their lives, more than anything else as well, and their businesses too. But it shows you as it's climate change. But it just seems to people, as we were talking earlier on, particularly people in power, have just ignored it. Oh, it's not going to happen, etc., etc. And when you saw the disgusting tweet from Murdo Fraser, the Tory MSP, saying, "Oh, let's have some more heat from these countries because I'm fed up with the rain," it shows you the absolute ignorance, contempt that they have for any form of climate change, not even sympathy or empathy for the people who are suffering through this as well. It's just amazing how it's caught it's caught hold in all of these countries, basically, and the speed of the fires. It's very frightening. Think about the animals as well, the wildlife and nature too, and it's something that they have to sit up and take note of. The fact that the climate is changing, and these winds are just pushing this further and further, as you explained in your opening remarks as well, about the firefighter, the two young firefighters that the plane crashed as well, but and they died. It's just horrendous to think you're looking at this at the moment, and people are still denying that climate change has anything to do with it. It's a national emergency. It's a world emergency, actually.
Thank you, Sandra. In its latest appraisal of Norway's economic performance, the International Monetary Fund reported that Norway grew strongly in 2022, but the pace of output growth receded somewhat this year. Record high energy and food prices, together with much higher interest rates, put pressure on households' purchasing power. However, mainland GDP growth is still expected to be positive, supported by strong business investments and exports. The fiscal position has remained solid, underpinned by very low public debt and high financial assets. Norges Bank continued to tackle stubborn inflation with 9 policy rate hikes over 2022 to 2023, raising policy rates to 3.75% by June in 2023. Inflation has been stubborn, but not least due to the weak krona and tight labour markets. The IMF said that Norway experienced one of the highest growth rates among advanced economies last year, and risks remain balanced. Growth is continuing, but at a more modest pace. The country has experienced windfall gains from high petroleum and natural gas prices that have so far countered global headwinds. Growth prospects remain favourable, and imminent risks are balanced, not least due to Norway's solid fundamentals and policy management. The external position in 2022 was moderately stronger than the level implied by medium-term fundamentals and desirable policies. On climate change, the IMF said that Norway continues to make important efforts in climate mitigation and adaptation. Among several initiatives, Norway has introduced a schedule of carbon price increases and has recently launched large-scale publicly supported projects for carbon capture and storage, although further efforts are needed to fulfil Norway's 2030 ambition under the Paris Agreement. Sandra, it's quite an interesting parallel here between Norway and Scotland, as both countries have a similar, similar inflation issue going on, similar population, but it seems that Norway are handling it seemingly much better than we are. Why do you think that is?
One word, it's an independent country in that respect, and it has this massive resources too, and it looks after its citizens as well. Basically, we're at Scotland, unfortunately, is at the mercy of the Westminster, and we discussed about not having any powers there also. I mean, you did mention it had been hit because obviously of COVID, and then you had the grain and the war in Ukraine and things like that, and yet it still came out very, very well, because basically they have put money into their country, they have invested into not just the country itself, but into the people also, in that respect. And if we had more powers in Scotland, we could very much be like Norway. In fact, a number of our, basically ideas that we put forward have come from the Nordic countries, emulating some of the stuff that's came from the Nordic countries. We don't, unfortunately, are able to get the monies from the oil and gas exploration. Yeah, we're looking at climate change. We actually, wanted to do the carbon capture. Westminster said no, took it away from us. There's lots of other things we wanted to do, marine biology aspects as well. Basically, we couldn't do that either. So we had to ask for permission, or we have to ask for permission. So this is the main reason. It's the same size of country. Basically, it's not that far from obviously the islands in Scotland to Norway, and yet it's been able, as you said, to basically ride out of this terrible recession that we're all in. And let's not forget, I think you mentioned about the IMF and the debt, etc. We need to remember here in Scotland that we can't borrow money in the Scottish Parliament. And we're also talking about the PPE and the situation there with the monies that we're going to have to pay back. Now, Westminster will say that Scottish Parliament has to have a share in that. It's part of our debt, even though we did not spend it. And that's another reason why we have to have independence. So for me, and for any, I think, right-thinking person, it's the only way. We can look at Norway and we can look at the other small Nordic countries and see how well they're doing. And then you look at Scotland with all of the resources we've got, and the entrepreneurs and lots of good small businesses and want to push forward, and we're hampered constantly by this Westminster government, and even more so now we're not in Europe, and that's made it even worse for us.
Thank you, Sandra. The renewable energy company Drax Group has received development consent from the Scottish Government for plans to build a new £500 million underground pumped storage hydro plant at its existing Cruachan facility in Argyll. The decision is a significant moment in Scotland's journey to net zero, with new long-duration storage plants critical to enabling more wind and solar power to come online in the next decade. Scotland's First Minister, Humza Yousaf, visited Drax's iconic power station on the shores of Loch Awe yesterday, where he underlined his call for the UK government to provide an appropriate market mechanism for hydropower and other long-duration energy storage technologies. Mr Yousaf recently wrote to Rishi Sunak calling on him to take action so developers can have the certainty required to build a new generation of pumped storage hydro plants. The new 600 megawatt plant at the Cruachan is part of a wider £7 billion strategic investment plan by Drax in clean energy technologies between 2024 and 2030, such as long duration storage and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which tackle climate change and enhance national energy security. Constructed adjacent to the existing underground facility, the plant would effectively more than double the site's total generation capacity to over 1 gigawatt. Growing pumped storage hydro capacity is crucial to integrating more wind and solar power onto the energy grid, enhancing the energy security while tackling climate change. Pumped storage plants act like giant water batteries by using reversible turbines to pump water from a lower reservoir to an upper reservoir, which stores excess power from sources such as wind farms when supply outstrips demand. These same turbines are then reversed to bring the stored water back through the plant to generate power when the country needs it. In a statement, First Minister Humza Yousaf said, "Yesterday I visited the impressive Cruachan Dam. The Scottish Government has approved Drax Group's plans for a pumped hydro storage plant at the site," adding hydropower has real potential to play a greater role in Scotland's transition to net zero, supporting hundreds of jobs and boosting our economy. Sandra, what do you make of this new development in the goal towards net zero?
I think it's very exciting, and following on from what we were just talking about Norway, basically, it follows on very neatly to the fact that we've put this money in to Drax, but we're also putting our hand and saying, please, the UK government, can you look at this, give us permission? And that is the annoying thing that makes you so angry in regard. It takes us right back up to the very first question we were asked, basically, is this a union of equals? Of course it's not a union of equals. This is exciting, it's fantastic. I mean, Scotland, through the wind farms, produces more than we need. And we've got this fantastic, exciting idea where we could create 1,000 jobs. I think I read about in constructing all of this. We could create 1,000 jobs, but it's also the expertise if we're coming away from oil and gas, which we could use. The people who work in that would have the expertise to work on this as well. So it's a win-win situation. But the fact of the matter is, we are at the mercy now, again, of Westminster to ask them if they will look at this and give us the extra money. I think even Drax has asked Westminster to look at this. But the one thing I noticed when I was reading the article from Drax was the fact that they keep calling it British all the time. British, basically. So one of my questions would be, and perhaps I will ask the First Minister in regards to this, if we get permission from the UK government and they say, yeah, that's great, go ahead, we will put the money into this, is this basically going to go to the Treasury? Is this any money that's made, is it going to go back to the Treasury? Is this the capture, basically, of the electricity? Is Scotland going to benefit from that? Or is it going to be part, as just now, sold down to, well, we pay to get her onto the grid, basically. Is this going to go down south and not benefit Scotland at all? Lots of wee questions in amongst this great announcement. I mean, I think it's exciting and it's the right way to go. The only unfortunate thing is we've got to keep asking permission. Can we do that? We've even got the developers having to say, you put some money into this, will you put some money into this? And that is the whole context of, is it, a union of equals? Of course it's not a union of equals. I mean, you've got to constantly ask permission to do something. They should do this, but they did the same with the carbon capture. They didn't give us permission for that either, basically. So the only way forward for us, independence, but the question comes up again, if we do get this up and running, who's going to be the owner of this? Is it going to be the Scottish people, or is it still going to be the UK Treasury? I'll put that to you, Lewis, see what you think.
It's an important question to ask, and I wish I had an answer.
Well, we'll maybe find out eventually in
Mm.
regards to that, but it's exciting, it's great, and it shows you, what we can do here in Scotland. we could do so much more though if we had the powers to do it.
Thank you, Sandra. Our final story tonight. Irish singer Sinead O'Connor has passed away at the age of 56. In a statement, the singer's family said, "It is with great sadness that we announce the passing of our beloved Sinead. Her family and friends are devastated and have requested privacy at this difficult time." The acclaimed Dublin performer released 10 studio albums, while her song Nothing Compares to You was named the #1 world single in 1990 by the Billboard Music Awards. Miss O'Connor was presented with the inaugural award for Classic Irish Album at the RTE Choice Music Awards earlier this year. The singer received a standing ovation as she dedicated the award for I Do Not Want What I Haven't Got to each and every member of Ireland's refugee community. "You're very welcome in Ireland. I love you very much and I wish you happiness," she said. Miss O'Connor is survived by her 3 children. Her son Shane died last year, aged 17. Miss O'Connor converted to Islam in 2018 and changed her name to Shuhada Sadakat, though continued to perform under the name Sinead O'Connor. In 2021, Miss O'Connor released a memoir, Rememberings, while last year a film on her life was directed by Catherine Ferguson. Very sad passing.
Very, very sad. I didn't know. That's the first I've heard of that. And yeah, I love the lady, a great singer, and I did admire her politics as well. Her social conscience that she had to refugees and other parts of the world as well. It's very, very sad. I'm sorry to hear that. And obviously, my thoughts, and I'm sure everyone else's thoughts, go to her family and friends in that respect. Shame. Yeah, very sad.
Thank you, Sandra. Well, that's it for this evening, but before I go, I just want to thank my guest Sandra, and I want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated, and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Right now, we have a pressing need to raise £30,000 to pay our bills and ensure we are able to continue making programmes. We have raised over £9,000 so far, but we need to raise the remaining £21,000 as soon as possible. Good night, and thank you for watching.